Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. The case that I'm going to be looking into today is the tragic case of James Bulger, who some of you may know as Jamie Bulger. This was a suggested case, so thank you for that. I appreciate any suggestions you guys have. I'd just like to let you know, I mean no disrespect whatsoever to anyone I talk about today. I've just gathered this information from the internet and compiled it into a video for educational purposes. James Patrick Bulger was born on the 16th of March in 1990 to parents Denise and Ralph in Kirby, Merseyside in England, which is part of Liverpool. James was only 2 years old when his life was stolen away from him by two 10-year-old boys. He was only 1 month away from his 3rd birthday, and it was a murder that really shocked Britain and still actually does shock Britain to this day. On Friday the 12th of February in 1993, Denise had taken James to the New Strand shopping centre, and while she was there she decided to call into the butcher's. Now, Denise was quite a cautious mother by all accounts, and normally she would always have James in a buggy, but this time he wasn't. He was walking and she was just obviously holding his hand. She let go of his hand for just a couple of minutes while she was searching for her purse in her bag, and she was distracted for, again, a couple of minutes. And before she knew it, she looked around and James had gone. Initially, I do think Denise thought that he'd probably just wandered off. Like I said, he was 2. She let go of his hand, and so he'd probably just outside the store or something like that. Or somewhere in the shopping centre. She truly believed that they would find him, and the entire shopping centre was alerted as to a missing child. She immediately contacted the police, and she exited the butcher's and turned left and went to look for her son. The police did searches of inside the shopping centre and outside of the shopping centre, but they just couldn't find him. He was nowhere. They thought maybe he'd wandered outside. If he had wandered off that far, maybe he had gone outside of the shopping centre, maybe he was just lost. But there was no sign of James. The initial searches didn't really lead anywhere, unfortunately, the first day. The second day, however, the shopping centre security had been going through their CCTV footage, and they found footage of James with 2 boys. And he actually left with them. The police did initially think these boys were around about the ages of 14 to 15, but the footage was really poor and they couldn't see faces, they couldn't tell who they were. They couldn't see really very much apart from sort of the clothing and things that they were wearing. When they showed this footage to Denise to make sure that this was James, she confirmed that it definitely was her son by what he was wearing. Now, it kind of put the parents at ease in a little sense of a sliver, because you wouldn't really think that these boys would hurt her son, right? Well, unfortunately, that was so far from the case. The police did a public appeal and Denise went on. She asked for the boys to return her son, if anybody had any information about him or just knew where he was or anything like that. And the police began looking into young sort of kids that were around about the age they thought, sort of that fit the description that they had. But like I said, the footage wasn't very good, but they just had to work on anything that they could. And they continued to search for James. 2 days after his disappearance, James Bulger's body was found on a railway line. Some children had been playing around the train tracks and they came across the grim discovery. Obviously the police were called and they cordoned it all off, and it must have been so traumatic. They were kids themselves. James's body was in a horrific way. So for them to find him there like that probably was very scarring for them, and it's something that they had to live with for the rest of their lives, and that kind of sight can haunt a person. But I will get into a little bit more details of obviously what happened to James a little later on in the case. So police really tried to get as much information as they could. This missing child case had gone from that to a possible murder case, so they needed to find out everything that they could, and they decided that they were going to release the CCTV footage to the public. Not only that, they decided to release the information on the journey that the lads had taken that they knew about, in the hopes that it would rile up the public, that people may have seen something that possibly they didn't know was of relevance at the time, and that would bring them to come forward and give this information. The public was traumatized, his family was traumatized, everyone was traumatized, and just everyone really wanted to find out what had happened. they wanted to help in any way that they could. People even came forward to try and say that they would clear up this CCTV footage to try and make it a better image so that they could find out who these boys were. The entire community was really behind the police and really behind the Bulger family. Everyone wanted answers on this case. This little boy had lost his life and they needed to know why and who had done it. A few days pass by and then a woman comes forward and she believes that she knows who one of the boys is in this video, and that also on the day that James went missing, that this boy was playing truant from school with his friend. The boys' names that she gave were John Venables and Robert Thompson, and these kids were just 10 years old. So the police went over, they immediately scooped the boys up and they brought them in for questioning. They told them what it was in relation to, and they didn't really know whether they had the right boys, because these boys that they were looking for initially they believed to be around 15 years old, and these boys were 10. Not only that, they looked so young for their age, so one of the police officers even said that one of them looked around the age of 8. And you just never really think that a child is capable of doing something like that, ever. Even now, 28 years later, with all the knowledge that we have, you still really like to think of children as being innocent and just totally incapable of doing something so brutal and horrific, and it's just awful. Anyway, as I said, they brought them in, they told them why, and one of the boys was visibly upset, and we don't know whether that was because they were frightened, they were in a police station and they were scared, or whether it was because of the murder. We're not sure on that one. It became clear pretty much straight away that the boys had done it. In the first interview, Robert just outright admitted that they'd killed James. But he said that it was John that had sort of done it, and that he told John that they needed to take James back.
I never even killed them. He grabbed the baby's hand and just walked around the strand. I told him to take him back.
You did what?
I told him to take him back.
You told him to take him back?
I don't know.
All right, Poppy.
The police had to be really patient with the boys. Obviously, they were really young themselves, and they didn't want to push them too far or sort of scare them too much or anything like that. They had to just take the time with it. And these boys were being questioned in relation to a murder of a 2-year-old, so it was just a really, really difficult situation. The boys' families must have been traumatized, thinking that their children couldn't have done something like this, and it's just an awful situation all around. But it slowly started to unearth what had happened. Robert said that John was the one that lured him James out of the shopping centre, and when they got to the train tracks, he was the one that actually hurt him, not Robert. And John didn't admit to anything for the first 4 interviews. It was on the second day of interviewing that they told John that Robert had actually already told them that they hurt James. And he said he was lying, that he didn't hurt him. And it was pretty much a lot of he said, she said kind of thing, back and forth, where they literally both were saying that the other was lying like all the time. They both lied about certain things. But then Robert would also tell some truths to it as well. For the first 2 days, at least, I believe that John didn't really say anything. His mother ended up speaking to him, and that was when John began talking.
A short while ago, as is detailed on your custody record out there, you had a conversation with your mum, and what was it you told us?
That I killed James.
He once more pretty much blamed it on Robert. He said that Robert threw bricks at James, knocking him over, and then when he got back up, he just carried on doing it. So they had the boys talking, and whilst they were doing that, police were trying to build a case against them. So they got the coat of one of the boys, which they were actually managed to put together with the CCTV footage of obviously the boys taking him away. So they had him on that one. They took the shoes that they were wearing and they were able to match blood found on them to James's blood. They also matched a blue Humbrol modelling paint found on James's body to the clothes that the boys were wearing. So they knew these boys had done it. They had all this evidence against them. They were just building their case stronger and stronger. But obviously they wanted to know what had happened that day, so eventually those details were revealed. So Robert and John had gone to Strand Shopping Centre. After skipping school, they stole some sweets, they stole the blue Humbrol paint, and they stole some batteries. After this, they began looking for a boy to take. They had actually apparently tried to take a girl weeks before, And on this day, they'd actually previously tried to take a different little boy, but they weren't successful when the mother kind of noticed or didn't let him out of the sight or something like that. They just weren't able to get this little boy. Their actual plan was to find a boy to abduct, lead them alongside the busy sort of road that went up the edge of the shopping centre, and then to push him into oncoming traffic. That was their plan. That was what these 10-year-old boys had going through their minds at the time, which I just can't fathom at all. Then they saw James. He was vulnerable, seemingly on his own after his mother had become distracted for a few minutes. They just took him by the hand and they led him straight out of that shopping centre. Obviously, they were caught on the CCTV doing it at 15:42. They walked around 3 miles across Liverpool, all the while assaulting James. He was pretty much crying the entire journey. And it was found out that eventually, over the journey, 38 people saw these kids, and most of them didn't think much of it. Most of them didn't stop to ask, to question why this boy was crying, why there were no parents around. Nobody asked anything. There were only 2 people that actually stopped them. And the boys just claimed that that was their brother and he'd fallen over something, got hurt, and that was why he's crying, and they were taking him home. And they also claimed to the other person that he was lost and they were taking him to the local police station. I believe that the person offered to take them and they just refused and they let them go. And I just want to put in here that these people must have felt absolutely awful about that. And you probably can imagine how much they would have tortured themselves over it. Not only the people that did stop them, but the people that didn't. Obviously after finding out what happened to James. This case just really, really haunted so many lives. And obviously it's not their fault. They just believed the boys. They took it for the face value. Again, people don't think that 10-year-old boys are going to hurt anyone. And that's the real sad aspect of this case. So at the beginning of the journey, they initially took him to the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, which is around about a quarter mile from New Strand Shopping Centre. They picked him up and dropped him on his head, where he suffered some face injuries. And they joked about pushing him into the canal, which is just not a joke at all, really. Eventually, the boys arrived at the village of Walton, and with literally the Walton Lane police station right across the road from them, they hesitated and they started to lead James up the bank to the train tracks. And that was where they began torturing him. Let me just put in a warning here, because this section of Jamie Bulger's case is really, really not spoken about, like, at all. And to say that the case is so well known in England and many places of the world now, it's purely because people just don't want to know what they did to that little boy. Even myself, I grew up knowing about this case. He would have literally been a year older than me. He was born the year before I was. And until I researched into this case, I didn't know the extent of what these boys did to him. This little 2-year-old baby boy just suffered so much, and for so long. These boys tortured him viciously. So I'm just going to warn you, if you don't actually want to know sort of the more intricate details of what they did, I'm not going to say everything, but most of it. And they're gruesome, don't get me wrong, they really are. I'll put a timestamp on the screen now and you can skip forward to that part so you'll miss this entire section. And that's totally understandable if you don't want to obviously find out this information and just skip this section completely. Both boys actually took part in this, although I think it was more Robert than John. James's official cause of death was due to beating. So like I said, he was beaten and tortured by the boys. One of them threw the blue paint into his left eye. They kicked him, they stamped on him, they threw bricks and stones at him. Finally, after doing this for a long amount of time and causing so many injuries, he had a lot of sort of laceration injuries, so probably from the stones and things being thrown at him, his little tender skin just, oh. Anyway, finally they picked up this 22-pound iron bar that was described as, I believe, like this railway fish plate, and they threw it onto James's body. From that, he got 10 skull fractures, and he just suffered so many injuries. There was a total of 42 injuries on James's body, and there was that much damage and things that they couldn't pinpoint what was the final blow, what actually caused his death. The boys then put his body on the train tracks, weighed down his head with rubble, just to make sure that he wasn't getting up again. And that's where they left him for the train to come, which did come, and it severed James's body in half. These two 10-year-old boys left this defenseless little 2-year-old baby boy on the train tracks, hoping that the train would come along and make it look like his death was an accident. And then they just left, not a care in the world, didn't think twice about it, off they went. It's believed that James had already succumbed to his injuries before the train hit him, so that he had obviously already passed away before he was cut in half. And it's thought that there was a sexual motive to this attack. James's clothes from the waist downwards had been removed, along with other disturbing things, which I'm not even going to get into because it's just awful. But both boys would state that there wasn't any sexual sort of motivation to it. If any of you guys have ever searched these boys up since then, especially if you're aware of John Venables, then you'll know that there probably was a sexual aspect to this case. Okay, so that's the awful details over with. If you've skipped that section, I completely don't blame you. We're now on to kind of the trial details. It would actually take 9 months to go to court, and obviously John and Robert were tried for James's murder. The public was angry, they were disturbed, and they were probably in disbelief. And that's the main thing that I can't get my head around personally in this case. I just can't understand how children can be capable of such atrocities as that. It's just awful. You just never think that kids are capable of doing that. Clearly they are, obviously they are, but I don't know, you just don't like to think that they are, especially not myself. The public were very angry, and they made it clear that they were very angry. Literally hundreds of people would turn up at court. They would hail the transport vans that the boys were in, and there were just so many of them. There were massive queues outside to try and get into the court. They all wanted to get a seat. They all wanted to make sure that these boys paid for what they did. During the court proceedings, John and Robert would actually only be referred to as boy A and B. And that was because they, of their age, their identities wouldn't be revealed because of that. Due to the rules back then, if you were basically sort of between the ages of 10 to 14, the prosecution would have to prove during the trial that these boys knew the difference between right and wrong. And they had to prove that. They had to prove that they understood that what they were doing was wrong and that it was harming James. And this was sort of the main thing that they needed to prove. They knew the boys had done it. They had all the evidence. They had everything. They just needed to prove that these boys knew exactly what they were doing and that what they were doing was completely wrong. And they did. They found John and Robert guilty of the murder of James Bulger in November of 1993. And that actually made them the youngest convicted murderers in Britain for 250 years. As I said, it's just shocking. Like, they'd not had anyone that young murder someone in 250 years. So yeah. Their sentence was to be detained by Her Majesty's pleasure. It was at this point that the judge ordered their identity to be revealed in the media, and they also ordered that once these boys had served their time, that nothing of them, the personal details, would ever be revealed again once they had new identities, giving them a chance to start a new life. John and Robert would only actually serve 8 years. They originally did only get 8 years, but due to an absolute uproar with the public, as it should be, that made them review it to 10 years. That again gained public outrage, and so the government increased it to 15 years. This would eventually be overturned again, and it was reduced back to 10 years. It was just an entire mess, if you ask me. So basically all they had to serve were, for the murder of a 2-year-old little boy, was 10 years. And like I said, they served 8. Just let me say, it really didn't go down well in the UK at all. But again, that was a sentence that they were given, and so that was what they got. They served it out in a children rehabilitation prison. Now, please don't get me wrong here, I do know that they have to try and rehabilitate these boys. But I don't think that their rehabilitation was really much of a punishment for what they did at all. So they were kids, they were given an education, they were looked after. They were taught how to live, how to go shopping, how to be self-sufficient. They would go to football matches, they would go swimming, and lots of things like that. When I looked into this, it seemed that they really got quite a lot actually. They got TVs, computers, they were allowed to decorate the room how they wanted, they were allowed to have all these designer clothes. And it just seems so wrong because I don't see how that's a punishment at all. How is that a punishment for murder? They were given this tuition to help them so that they could go for the GCSEs, the A-levels, which a lot of people in the UK can't afford to give their children. Sort of a really good education, which these boys were just handed. They just handed it to them. As I said before, I get it's rehabilitation. But when most children outside don't really get these things, and they're given money to go out and wear these designer clothes and other things like that, when most parents who work all their life can't afford to provide their children with things like that, which, you know, it really annoys a lot of people in the UK. And it did really annoy a lot of people in the UK. It probably still does. They gained a lot to say that they were supposed to be in prison, such as trips out, things like that. I know they have to let them out as part of rehabilitation. They have to try and integrate them in the society again, and obviously have them around people and teach them life skills. But wouldn't that be best done in something like a supermarket, teaching them how to buy food rather than at Gucci? It just could have been done in a way more that they were getting punished rather than in this lovely decorated room receiving this really, really fantastic education, better than most people, going to football games, which I don't see as essential. Most people who love football will never go to a football game in obviously the designer clothes. It's not exactly a strict punishment, and I just think it was just ridiculous. Obviously they didn't lead a normal childhood. They didn't have their parents around them. They didn't have any siblings or the family. They weren't allowed to do whatever they wanted. But when they did do whatever they wanted, it ended up in a 2-year-old little boy being murdered. I could rant about this all day. It just seriously riled me up reading into all of this. As you can see, I don't agree with how they treated these, and I just feel like they got a lot of luxuries that most hardworking people who haven't murdered somebody would never ever get to see. It was also said that whilst in prison, the boys suffered from PTSD from what they'd done, and John apparently did suffer more from that. He was having nightmares over what he'd done in flashbacks, which I have no sympathy for that because, well, he shouldn't have done it in the first place. So in 2001, at the age of 18, they were released, they were given their new identities, and they were sent off to start their new lives, which, as some of you know, cost millions of pounds. It costs so much money to do something like that. They were actually banned from returning to Merseyside, so at least that's something, I guess. A few years later, John Venables reoffended. He was arrested for having disturbing and indecent pictures of children, of which he pled guilty to, and he was sentenced to 2 years. It was also found out that John had been violating his terms of release. He was drinking in pubs around Merseyside, he was going to football games in the area, which, as I said, he was banned from. He was literally, I believe, 5 minutes away from the Bulger household the entire time he'd been out of prison, which, once more, it's absolutely disgraceful that he was allowed to get away with it. He was supposed to be banned from going there, and he was just there. He just didn't care. This case really, really got under my skin properly researching it. Like I said, I've been aware of the case, but it's when you properly look into it and find all this stuff that they got in prison, and they were given these new identities. John broke all his terms of release for 9 years and again got away with it, and the courts then still ordered that John's new identity wouldn't be revealed. Then in 2018, John Venables pleaded guilty to having more indecent pictures of children. Again, he was sentenced to 3 years and 4 months. I didn't actually find anything on Robert reoffending after he was released, so we don't really know anything on him. Maybe his rehabilitation worked and he's living out his life somewhere far away from these horrible, horrible things, but clearly John's did not work. John was more the troublemaker, it seems. He revealed his identity twice. So the taxpayers paid millions and millions to give him new identities to this murderer who had murdered a 2-year-old little boy, bearing in mind. And he just goes out and tells people who he is. Twice. That resulted in being changed yet again. And I believe at one point they even actually put him in prison to stop him from revealing his identity again and costing the government even more money. They're so trying so hard to protect him and pulling out all the stops for him, and he just didn't care. He's just telling everyone. It just doesn't seem like he's rehabilitated at all to me. Once more, I'd never condone what he did because I just couldn't, and nobody ever could. But the government were trying to save his life, essentially. If people found out who he was, they'd probably hunt him down for what he did. It wouldn't surprise me if somebody sort of hunted down his life for it, and the government are trying to protect him from that. They've given him these identities so that to keep his safety, and he just keeps revealing it. He just keeps giving it to, sometimes I guess there's no help in some people. Denise and Ralph did end up getting divorced due to the grief of losing their son. They couldn't get over it, not that anyone ever could. Their relationship sort of didn't manage to break through on the other side because of it. I do believe though eventually they found new partners and they began families of their own once more. Denise, from what I could find, ended up having 3 sons, but they all know about their oldest brother James, and he's still an integral part of their family. She also went on to write a book called I Let Him Go. Her book is apparently painful and a traumatic read, as you can imagine. She revealed in it that she is actually haunted by the idea that at the end James was calling for her and she didn't come, which is just so sad. I mean, the title alone just completely breaks my heart. I Let Him Go. And for years she did blame herself, like most people would, most parents would. For one, why didn't she take his buggy? She always took his buggy. This fateful day she didn't. Why did she let go of his hand? Why did she turn left instead of right when she went out looking for him? If she would have turned right, she might have been able to catch up to him sooner and find him. It did take her a very long time to come to terms with the fact that she didn't kill her son. Those boys killed her son. It's so easy for us to blame ourselves when bad things happen. What if I did this? What if I did that? What if I didn't do this? Things would have been different. But the fact remains that those boys on that day chose to make that vile decision. They had such ill intent, and that was never anybody else's fault but their own. So if you're interested in reading this book, I suggest that you do check it out, because it sounds like it is quite a good read, but obviously a very sad and painful one too. This case was just so sad, tragic, disgusting, and it just made me so angry and upset. The entire thing did. The justice that they received, all of it, in my eyes, they didn't really receive much justice, to be honest, but that's just my opinion. But my heart truly breaks for James, for his family, for each and every person that was affected by this case and that will be affected by this case. This case was a really heavy one, and children cases especially affect me personally and a lot of people because they're just so small and so innocent, and they've not really had a chance at life yet, and they never will. Like James, he never got a chance at life, and it's just tragic. James Bulger was a beautiful, innocent little boy, and his memory will live on for a very long time. But most of all, James's mother really wants him to be remembered as the little boy that loved making people laugh. She said he had this very bubbly personality, and he loved dancing to Michael Jackson videos. Denise stated that her happiest memory of James was him running towards her with his hair bouncing everywhere. She said that he never walked anywhere, he always ran. He'd run into your arms with this big smile on his face, and that he was just this fun, loving, kind little boy, and that is how she wants him to be remembered. She doesn't want him to be remembered as the little boy that was murdered by 2 10-year-old boys. She wants him to be remembered for the boy that he was, just this happy, bubbly little boy. And that's really what we need to keep in mind with this case, because that's how we keep him alive in our hearts and in our memories. But that's the end of the case. Again, it was a heavy one. Kind of been slightly avoiding that one, but it was a suggested case, so obviously I did it for you guys. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Give me a big thumbs up if you have, and subscribe to my channel for similar content. Anyway guys, that's all I have today on the case of James Bulger. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye.